My dear brothers and sisters, to be alive on this day is itself a blissful experience and a privilege. Because this is the day that is the 100th anniversary of one of the most important days in the spiritual history of the world, an event that took place 100 years ago, but which had profound implications for centuries to come. This was the day on which the mother arrived in Pondicherry for the second and final time on the 24th of April 1920. Let me first briefly construct the scene of that period. The mother sailed for Pondicherry from Japan in March and arrived in Pondicherry on the 24th of April, exactly 100 years ago. She was accompanied by her husband, Paul Richard, and a British lady, Dorothy Hodgson, who later came to be known as Datta in the Pondicherry Ashram. And when they were nearing Pondicherry, while their ship was still about 2 nautical miles away from Pondicherry, the mother experienced a physical change in the atmosphere. And this happened although she was not expecting it, which makes it even more significant. It's not that it was fulfillment of an expectation. She was quite familiar with the spiritual atmosphere that Sri Aurobindo created everywhere. She had been here earlier in 1914, and of course on an occult plane she had been in communication with him. One doesn't know for how long. But she says that this was more than that type of a spiritual atmosphere. It was a physical experience similar to feeling a change in altitude or a change in temperature. So this is what she ascribed to the aura of Sri Aurobindo. And then, of course, from 24th of April, when she arrived, she never left Pondicherry for a single day physically till she left the body on the 17th of November in 1973. Now, if you look at the whole thing in retrospect and go back a little even further behind 1920, one finds that there seems to be a divine plan at work which worked with clockwork precision. Now, this is the type of planning that ordinary mortals like me can see only in retrospect, but still it is an interesting exercise. It was during Sri Aurobindo's stay in prison during 1908 to 1909 that he had discovered the mission of his life. The mission of his life was to give to the world that spiritual wisdom which it was going to need very soon, because the world was very soon going to be materially supersaturated, especially the Western world, and the rest of the world was going to develop a fascination for that type of a saturation with the material comforts, but it would in the process get spiritually starved, and therefore this is the type of wisdom that the world needed and which only he could give. And to fulfill that mission, he went to Pondicherry in 1910. The fact that he went to Pondicherry, and Pondicherry was a French colony, was more than a coincidence, because his collaborator was to come from France. He went there in 1910. The mother's husband, Paul Richard, visited Pondicherry in 1910 and expressed the wish that he would like to bring his wife as well. And Sri Aurobindo told him to come after 4 years. So again, a very precise planning at work. Sri Aurobindo needed these 4 years for going further deeper within, and he was making notes of whatever experiences he was going through during those 4 years. And the result was that over these 4 years, he was so full up with the wisdom that he had to share with the world that it just needed a little trigger to unleash a tsunami of wisdom. That trigger came in the form of the mother and her husband again, who came in 1914 on the 29th of March, and they provided that trigger. They sort of turned the tap on, and the spiritual wisdom which Sri Aurobindo was to share with the world was poured on the pages of the Arya for more than 6 years. So the process started in 1914 when the mother triggered it in 1914, but then in less than a year she went back in 1915, and then we find that after spending about a year in France, she went to Japan, where she went in 1916 and stayed there till 1920, till she came to Pondicherry once again. Now, her stay in Japan also had a great significance because Maheshwari she was born as, that is the form she had started expressing as a child when she told her mother that her mission was to remove misery from the world. So she was looking at the entire world, and her mission was to remove the misery with which it was afflicted, the misery which we take as a sort of a given in this world, but her mission was to eradicate it by going to the very roots of this misery. Then in Japan, she found a suitable soil for tapasya of her Mahalakshmi and Mahasaraswati forms, beauty and perfection. These are the two things that she has emphasized the most while talking of her experiences in Japan. You know, it's such a place that even if they throw garbage in Japan, they don't just throw it, they arrange it in such a way that it looks like a piece of sculpture. So that beauty and perfection. If food has to be eaten, it has to be only in a certain way, not in any other way. Any other way would be wrong. If some words have to be spoken, they have to be spoken exactly the way they should be. Any other difference, any change would make it wrong. And if one has to bow, even that has to be done in a certain way. Any other way would be wrong. So that's sort of a perfection. So beauty and perfection, the two important characteristics of Mahalakshmi and Mahasaraswati, for that was the most suitable place. How about Mahakali? That probably she left for Pondicherry, where she would come, spend a long time, and find many naughty children like me. So that is how she had a suitable soil for the tapasya for all her 4 aspects. Now it is with this background that she arrived here in 1920. And by then, the publication of the Arya was coming towards an end. Sri Aurobindo felt that he had shared enough that was of relevance to not only that period, but for many centuries to come for this world. Not that he didn't have anything more to say, as he revealed in one of the conversations with his disciples, but he said, first realize what I have already written or said. So that was nearing an end, but at that stage his concern was to form a sangha, a community, and a place which would be able to put those teachings into practice. And the mother came with exactly the same sort of a mission, because she has said that as a young person, she often felt that there should be some place in the world where genuine spiritual seekers should be able to grow spiritually through the work that they do without having to worry about the physical necessities of life. In fact, Sri Aurobindo and the mother were 2 bodies only on the surface. They were one consciousness, but 2 bodies, and that's why you will hardly ever find in history 2 collaborators who could be that alike. Even before the mother came to India, even the first time in 1914, one finds that the talks that she has given or whatever she has written, which is available in words of long ago, there's such a remarkable similarity, or rather identity, between what she has said and what Sri Aurobindo has taught. So 2 collaborators were necessary because one body could not have done what they did together, and that is why it was necessary. So in 1920, time had come for that collaborator to arrive, because the theory was over, it had been put down in the Arya, now was the time for practice. Then she arrived in April 1920. November 1920, her husband left because he could not surrender to Sri Aurobindo to the same extent as the mother was prepared to do. And within a few days, on the 24th of November 1920, there was a storm, a terrible storm, and the house in which the mother was living with her friend Dorothy Hodgson, that was in a precarious condition. So Sri Aurobindo sent word that they should move in to the house where he was living. And just mark the date, 24th November 1920, and exactly 6 years later, on the same date, 24th November 1926, was founded formally Sri Aurobindo Ashram. So she arrived on 24th April. 24 seems to be a very important number, a multiple of 12. She arrived on the 24th of April in 1920. The storm came on 24th November 1920. So now we have to see what sort of a storm we get on the 24th of November in 2020. That will be the 100th anniversary of that storm. To some extent, we can already get some sense of that storm from the coronavirus pandemic. So anyway, so this storm came on the 24th of November 1920, and the mother and her friend, they moved into the house where Sri Aurobindo was staying, and then there was another 6 years gap before the ashram was formally founded. What happened in these 6 years? The mother was at the same level of consciousness as Sri Aurobindo, but she did not show it. She showed as if she was a disciple, and as if she was starting from scratch. Whatever she had done earlier was only a preparation. So one thing that she did was to go deep within during these 6 years, so that she would be as an instrument fit for carrying on Sri Aurobindo's work, although she was fully capable of doing it even when she arrived, but that she left to Sri Aurobindo to say that her consciousness and his consciousness are the same. The second thing that happened during those 6 years was that she established Sri Aurobindo as the guru. She adopted him as a guru, and this is what prompted a few friends of Sri Aurobindo who were staying with him there also to adopt him as a guru, because till then they were just friends who had accompanied him from Pondicherry, just 3 or 4 friends of his, and they were with him in the freedom struggle, and they came with him to Pondicherry. So although they could see that he was far above their level of consciousness, in terms of the level of consciousness, but still they treated him as a friend and he treated them as a friend. So it was she who established Sri Aurobindo as the guru. And the third thing that she and her friend Datta did was to bring organization and order in the house where they were living on a small scale. It was going to be on a much bigger scale in the ashram, but here also the number gradually started growing, and it reached about 25 by the time the ashram was formally established in 1926. So starting with about 5 to 25, the number kept growing, but that gave a suitable field for the mother to show her organizational skills. And in fact, this is one of the advantages she has talked about also of the First World War from 1914 to 1918. She says one thing that that war brought out was that when the men went away to the battlefield, the women could get an opportunity to show their organizational skills. And when it came to that, the mother was a perfectionist, and she could show that, and these two ladies together from Europe could bring an order and organization to that small little setup, which grew gradually from about 5 to 25 over a period of these 6 years. And the fourth thing that happened during these 6 years was the acceptance of the mother as the mother. Because to start with, the disciples who had come earlier would feel that they have been here much earlier, they have been associated with Sri Aurobindo for much longer, and these two European ladies have just come, and one of them is being given charge of the ashram. But then these 6 years gave everybody an opportunity to see who she was, and what she could do, and what nobody else could do. And that's how she got accepted as the mother on the 24th of November 1926, when Sri Aurobindo Ashram, Pondicherry, was formally established. Now, from 1926 to 1973, over these nearly 50 years, the mother was looking after the ashram and the residents of the ashram, the disciples, as a real mother. Affectionate, taking care of all their needs, and yet a disciplinarian and a perfectionist, and providing absolutely the right examples. And while Sri Aurobindo was in seclusion all those years and therefore replied only to letters, she was the one who was available to answer questions which came from the disciples. All types of questions, some important, some not so important, some outright frivolous, but she answered all of them with great patience, infinite patience and wisdom. And in that process, she generated an immortal piece of work which is available in the form of her questions and answers, several volumes of them, which give practical guidance to seekers on the type of difficulties which sadhaks those days had, and which they always have and will probably always continue to have. So it's an immortal piece of lasting value that she provided through these dialogues and conversations and talks and writings that she did from 1926 to 1973. She also demonstrated that hers and Sri Aurobindo's philosophy of a life-affirming spirituality, which did not necessarily require physical renunciation of life, was not just theory, it could be put into practice. So the Pondicherry ashram was a sort of a laboratory where this philosophy was being put into practice, and it was demonstrated that it is not just theory, it can actually be practiced. And one of the most important examples of this practice was of far-reaching value was establishment of the school. The school in which she founded in 1943, and which is just completed a few years back in 2018, 75 years. Now, why this is important is because the whole idea of a higher level of consciousness changing human nature, which was the mission of the Mother and Sri Aurobindo for the world as a whole, has to be put into effect by the coming generations. And that can happen not just because they are born different, but more than that, that they go through a different type of education. And that is what she demonstrated, how it can be done, how one can put the psychic being at the center and have the education of the physical, the vital, and the mental revolve around this psychic center, so that these instruments, the physical, vital, and the mental, which are instruments, important instruments, and important adhar, but instruments all the same, so that these instruments can then work in the light of the guidance coming from within, from the psychic being. And that is what she demonstrated. And this is what went on from 1926 onwards. There were a few important milestones even within that period, and I'll try to recount a few of them. One was 1950, when Sri Aurobindo left the body. That was an important milestone because Sri Aurobindo said that for their mission, his and the mother's, to be completed, one of them had to leave. And it is he who will leave. The mother's body was more plastic, and therefore she should continue. And that's how he left the body in 1950, and then the mother continued that work. As she had said, on the day just before the founding of Auroville in her statement, that she came to India, to Pondicherry, to meet Sri Aurobindo. She stayed on to be with Sri Aurobindo, and after Sri Aurobindo left the body, she continued his work. So after 1950, she continued the work, and a significant milestone in that came in 1956 on the 29th of February, when the supramental consciousness descended into the Earth atmosphere. Descending into the Earth atmosphere only means that the possibility of its manifestation was created. But for it to manifest on a significantly large scale would still need time. And that is what we are finding in a way happening. Because if you see after 1956 onwards, there has been a sort of a ferment in the world. It was around 1956 that the Western world had reaped to a very large extent the benefits of the Industrial Revolution and become prosperous, and therefore they were at that stage of supersaturation with material comforts, were spiritually starved, and this vacuum was felt by their younger generation, by their children. And that is what gave us the hippie movement in the 1960s. The hippies were groping. They sort of didn't want to fit into the same structure which their parents had come to relish. For the parents, it was newfound prosperity. For the children, it was something which they could take for granted. And they found that it was somehow hollow, it was shallow, and they were looking for something deeper. They were groping, but didn't know what the alternative could be. And it took them a few decades to find the alternative in ancient Indian wisdom. And that's why we find that the hippie movement gradually fizzled out. But then it served an important purpose, because it is in that process, through that movement, that they discovered on a pretty large scale the ancient Indian wisdom. And some of them did it by reading Sri Aurobindo, some of them did it without reading Sri Aurobindo and the mother, but that doesn't matter. What is important is that the ground that Sri Aurobindo and the mother had prepared had started showing results. Under whatever banner it was being carried out, it was their work that was being carried out. And the result was that many of these youngsters who were groping in the 1960s and then discovered ancient wisdom, Indian wisdom, as the solution to the problems of human existence, they, by the 1980s and 90s, became spiritual teachers, spiritual leaders. Probably a few of them also became spiritual masters, although they won't say so. And there was such a spate of this sort of writing, which was talking about not only how we could get rid of pain and misery, which had been taken as something granted in the world, but also started talking in terms of this solution being available on a larger scale, so that the world need not any longer be a place of misery as it has been considered to be. So they were talking of a rise in the consciousness of the human race. They may be talking about it in different languages and may be talking about it without reading Sri Aurobindo and the mother, which makes it more significant, because that's what makes us feel that it was in the air, it was in the atmosphere. Gary Zucker may call it not supramental consciousness, but the descent of multisensory human beings, but comes to exactly the same thing. They were all talking of future evolution, an evolution that will give us a human race that will be distinctly different at a perceptibly higher level than the present level of consciousness, and the number of such people in the world will cross that critical mass so as to bring about a change in human nature. What we have come to accept as the lower human nature or the ordinary human nature will no longer be the norm, or at least on a much significant scale will be a much higher level of consciousness, a consciousness which is love-driven rather than ego-driven. And when that happens, the affairs of the world will be conducted from that higher plane of consciousness, and that is when the misery and pain and suffering with which the world has been identified will no longer exist on this earth. So that sort of a ferment has been visible throughout the 1960s till now, but all the same this was confined to a few whose receptivity was pretty high and who took to this path and were busy with their spiritual quest, wishing that it should become widespread, attracting a large number of disciples and followers, But all the same, side by side was going on a lot of clashes, conflicts, chaos in the world, which was much more apparent than this relatively silent revolution changing the human nature that was also on. And the result was that one seemed a little skeptical sometimes. Can human nature really change? And to bring about that sort of a change, a jolt was needed. A jolt is needed by individuals, and the jolt is needed by societies, and the jolt is needed by the world. We can grow through good fortune, we can also grow through misfortune. But the sad fact is that most of us grow through misfortune rather than through good fortune. Misfortune is what gives us that jolt. The same is true also of societies and the world needed a jolt, and nobody could have foreseen in what form that jolt will come. The jolt came in the form of this coronavirus pandemic through which the world is going right now. And what all positive things it has done, I need not talk about. I don't think I'll be talking anything very original, because so many positive messages are doing the rounds on all types of social media, and everybody is talking about them. Suddenly everybody has become aware of all the positive things that can happen in a state of suffering or difficulty when we have a problem. But I just point out two important things that it has done. One is it has generated in a very large number of human beings the reaction of fear. And this is something which is not confined only to one part of the world or the other. This sense of fear has taken hold of the world. Countries which were so proud of their resources, so powerful, they have been just as much affected as the relatively less developed countries. Their healthcare system, of which they were very proud, has been overwhelmed. The economy, which was so strong, has gone down. And it is in such a state that when such a drastic change takes place within such a short period, something completely unimaginable, unexpected, that one turns to a higher source. And so fear can be also something positive. Reminds me of that those lines from a Christian hymn which says, grace it was that taught me how to fear, and grace it was that my fears relieved. So it is grace that gives us this sort of a fear, and it is divine grace that will also relieve us of this fear. The second thing that it has done is to induce a feeling of oneness, because when it comes to this pandemic, dealing with it, we are all one. The world is one. And that reminds me of that Mahavakya from Savitri, to feel love and oneness is to live. The world is learning to live through this feeling of oneness. This is what human existence is about, to discover that oneness which we all have in any case at the spiritual level. At the spiritual level, we are all one. Our differences with respect to the color of the skin or the type of clothes we wear, the languages we speak, the gender and religion and race and so on and so forth, all these are very superficial, insignificant differences as compared to the oneness that unites us as souls which have emanated from the same single source. So that is what unites us, and to discover that oneness is a great discovery. And this jolt has done it within such a short time, something which does not happen in several centuries of normal existence, so-called normal existence. And that is why this jolt was necessary. And what type of a oneness is this? This oneness is a psychological oneness. It's at the psychological level, spiritual level, that we feel one. And that is what Aurobindo has talked about in the ideal of world unity, that yes, the world should unite, but this unity should not be an empire built through armed conquest And I'm sure certainly he would not mean that it should be a unity built through economic or intellectual colonialism, but he has said that it should be the type of oneness that is achieved through psychological means, a psychological oneness which lets diversity stay, but this diversity should not be able to divide us. So oneness in spite of the diversity, and that is what this has created. I'll end this. I've already run a little out of, I had planned to speak for only half an hour, spoken a little longer. But a few lines from Savitri. And let me establish the context of these lines. These are the lines which come in Canto 11. By Canto 11, Savitri has already vanquished the god of death. She had a long debate with the god of death, as you know, and finally she reveals herself and her mission to the god of death, and he disappears. But then that is not the end. She passed the test to which the god of death put her by giving her all types of temptations and giving her an apparently very realistic view of the world, but she was not taken in by that. But that was not the end of her test. Then spoke the divine voice itself, which again started convincing her that do not try to disturb the order of things. This is how the world is meant to be. Be satisfied with your own individual personal salvation. But then when she kept refusing that, she didn't fall into that temptation. Finally, this voice of the divine also told her that her mission, the mission with which she has come, shall be accomplished through her. So, the last time that warning was sounded by that voice, that she should not persist and instead be satisfied with her own salvation, to that Savitri gave a very short four-line reply. Then all the women yearningly replied, "Thy embrace, which rends the living knot of pain, the joy, O Lord, in which all creatures breathe, thy magic flowing waters of deep love, thy sweetness give to me for earth and men." So she is asking the divine for that embrace, the joy, that magic, that love, that sweetness. Whom should the divine give it? Give it to her for, not for herself, but for earth and men. So in these 4 lines, she once again repeated the same prayer, the same request, and this time the reply was positive. That voice spoke and said, "O beautiful body of the incarnate word, thy thoughts are mine. I have spoken with thy voice. Whatever you have been saying you want to do is actually what I wanted. These were my words. My will is thine. So what you want to do is my will too. My will is thine. What thou hast chosen, I choose. All thou hast asked, I give to earth and men." So what you asked for earth and men, I give them that. Then, here's a sentence which appears very prophetic. Again spoken by the divine voice on the next page. "I'll pursue thee across the century. Thou shalt be hunted through the world by love, naked of ignorance's protecting veil, and without covert from my radiant gods. I'll pursue thee across the century." And exactly a century later, we find this happening. "I'll pursue thee across the century." You know, that's a prophetic sentence. He already knew while writing this. "I'll pursue thee across the century. Thou shalt be hunted through the world by love. Naked of ignorance's protecting veil, and without covert from my radiant gods." Your divinity will no longer be hidden. It will not be hidden by the veil of ignorance, and you will not be in some sort of a disguise. You will be known exactly for what you are. and this is how I'll pursue you for a century. And then on the next page, another prophetic sentence, my fiercest masks shall my attractions bring. The divine voice is saying that human beings will be attracted to me by my fiercest masks. My masks which appear very frightening, are harsh and cruel. So the coronavirus is also a mask of the divine. It's a fierce mask, but then that is a mask designed to bring the attractions, to attract the human race to the divine. My fiercest masks shall my attractions bring. And then on the next page, hearts touched by thy love shall answer to my call. Now, hearts touched by thy love, Savitri's love, in other words, the mother's love, the hearts that are touched by you shall answer to my call. They would be receptive. Answering to the call itself is a great thing, because earlier Sri Aurobindo has talked about what is a more commonplace thing. The heaven's call is rare. Rarer still are those that heed to it. So the call itself is rare, but very few, even among those who are called, actually respond positively. But now they would. Hearts touched by thy love shall answer to my call. So that is a great change that will take place. And it will take place not on a small scale, not amongst a select few, but in large numbers. So a few pages later, that voice is prophesying, even the multitude shall hear the voice. Large numbers would hear the voice. Even the multitude shall hear the voice and turn to commune with the Spirit within and strive to obey the high spiritual law. This earth shall stir with impulses sublime, humanity awake to deeper self, nature, the hidden Godhead recognize. So even the multitude shall hear the voice, large numbers, common people, and turn to commune with the Spirit within. They would start communicating, speaking to that Spirit within, which normally remains hidden from view, and strive to obey the high spiritual law instead of following the ordinary sort of desires and attractions of the physical and vital. They would start obeying the higher spiritual law. This earth shall stir with impulses sublime, humanity awake to deeper self, nature, the hidden Godhead recognize. Even the many shall some answer make. Once again, the emphasis is on large numbers, because you see that number is critical. That critical mass of the human race at a higher level of consciousness, what is important, and that is what this pandemic might do. Of course, some cynics would say that, well, it all happens in an emergency, but very soon all is forgotten. Yes, quite a bit may be forgotten, but even if it makes a little bit of a difference, a fraction of the awakening that we can see all around during the pandemic, if a fraction of it stays, even that would have been a remarkable advance. Even the many shall some answer make, and bear the splendor of the divine's rush and his impetuous knock at unseen doors. So, many should answer the call of the knock at the doors which normally remain unseen, and they shall be able to bear the splendor of the divine's rush, that dazzling effect that the divine creates, that dazzle they'll be able to stand. So this is what we find these prophetic sentences in Savitri, the divine voice speaking to Savitri, who was none other than the mother. And this is what puts the significance of today in its proper perspective, its significance for the future to come, maybe centuries to come, but this is an important landmark, this century since the mother arrived with this mission. And I've tried to sort of give you my limited understanding of how I look at these events of these 100 years and why this is so important.